Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we are bringing you 7 of the most deeply disturbing, true Appalachian deep woods horror stories that have ever been documented. These accounts come from the oldest mountain range in North America, where something ancient still watches from the shadows between the trees. What you are about to hear are not campfire legends or folklore passed down through generations, but verified encounters experienced by real people who made the mistake of venturing into places where the forest has its own rules. From law enforcement officials who investigated disappearances that defy explanation, to hikers who found themselves stalked by things that should not exist, each story has been cross-referenced with witness statements, police reports, and historical records that confirm something terrifying is happening in those mountains. The Appalachian wilderness holds secrets that predate human civilization. And tonight, you will discover why those who know the deep woods best refuse to enter certain areas after dark. If you want authentic horror content that documents the unexplained darkness lurking in America's most remote forests, subscribe to Buried Files and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the unknown. We want to hear your own experiences in the comments below, especially if you have encountered something in the Appalachian region that you cannot explain. Now turn down your lights and prepare yourself as we descend into the heart of Appalachian terror. Jack grew up in a remote hollow, tucked deep within the mountains of eastern Kentucky, where the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away, and the closest town was a 40-minute drive on winding gravel roads that turned to mud whenever it rained. The hollow had been in his family for 5 generations, passed down from his great-great-grandfather, who had carved out an existence in that isolated valley back when the railroad was still being built through the mountains. The cabin where Jack was raised sat at the end of a narrow dirt track that wound through dense forest, surrounded by peaks that rose so steeply on all sides that the sun only reached the valley floor for a few hours each day. It was the kind of place where silence had weight, where the darkness at night was absolute, and where the forest felt less like scenery and more like something alive that was constantly watching. Jack's grandmother had lived in that hollow her entire life, and she knew the mountains better than anyone. She taught Jack which plants were safe to eat, where the best fishing holes were located, and how to read the weather by watching the way the mist moved through the trees. But there was one lesson she repeated more than any other, and it was delivered with a seriousness that made young Jack understand this was not advice to be ignored. She told him there were certain parts of the woods where a person should never go alone, and there were places where even groups should not venture after the sun began to set. She said the mountains were old, older than anyone could properly understand, and that in some hollows and along certain ridges, something watched back when you looked into the trees. She never explained what that something was, and Jack learned not to ask, because the look in her eyes when she spoke about it made him understand that some questions were better left unasked. Over the years, Jack heard the stories that his family rarely spoke about, but that everyone seemed to know. There was an old logging road that wound through the deepest part of the hollow, cutting through a section of forest that had been partially cleared in the 1930s when a lumber company had briefly operated in the area. The company had shut down abruptly, and the road had been left to grow over, though it was still visible if you knew where to look. Local hunters avoided that area entirely, especially after dark, and there were whispers about why. Jack's uncle had disappeared near that old logging road back in the summer of 1983. He had gone out bow hunting before dawn, something he had done hundreds of times before, and when he failed to return by nightfall, the family organized a search. They found him 3 days later, wandering along a creek bed 6 miles from where he had parked his truck, with no memory of where he had been or how he had gotten there. But what disturbed the family most was that his uncle looked different. He had aged years in just 3 days, his hair noticeably grayer, his face deeply lined in ways it had not been before, and his eyes held a haunted quality that never quite went away. He refused to discuss what had happened, and within a year he had moved away from the mountains entirely, settling in a flat suburb of Lexington where he never had to look at the forest again. Jack's family made it clear that the old logging road and the abandoned camp at its end were strictly off-limits. His father said it with the casual tone of someone stating an obvious fact. But his grandmother said it like she was delivering a warning that could mean the difference between life and death. Jack obeyed that rule throughout his childhood, partly from respect and partly from a primal instinct that told him some boundaries existed for good reason. But when Jack turned 17, his respect for those boundaries began to erode, replaced by the kind of fearless curiosity that belongs to young people who have not yet learned that some fears are entirely rational. He and 2 of his friends, Dylan and Luke, decided they were going to hike out to the old logging camp and prove once and for all that the stories were nothing more than superstition and family legend. They set out on a Saturday morning in late October, when the leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, but had not yet begun to fall in earnest. The air was crisp and clear, perfect hiking weather, and the 3 of them were in high spirits as they made their way along the overgrown logging road. It took them nearly 3 hours to reach the camp, bushwhacking through sections where the forest had reclaimed the road entirely, and by the time they arrived, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the ridgeline. The camp was more intact than Jack had expected. There were 3 collapsed buildings, their roofs caved in and their walls leaning at dangerous angles, and scattered around the site were pieces of rusted equipment, ancient saw blades, and the remains of what might have once been a truck, now reduced to little more than a corroded frame and 4 wheels. Dylan joked about how disappointing it was, how there was nothing scary about a bunch of old junk slowly being consumed by the forest. Luke agreed, pointing out that it was just another abandoned site like dozens of others scattered throughout the mountains. But Jack felt something different. There was a quality to the silence at the camp that seemed unnatural, as if the forest was holding its breath. The usual sounds of birds and insects that had accompanied them on the hike were absent here, replaced by a stillness that felt less like peace and more like the quiet before something terrible happens. He mentioned it to his friends, but they dismissed his concerns, attributing his unease to the creepy stories his family had told him. They spent the next hour exploring the site, taking photos with their phones, and generally treating the whole experience like the adventure they had hoped it would be. But as the sun touched the ridge and the light began to fade, Jack noticed that his friends had become quieter, their earlier bravado giving way to a subtle nervousness that they tried to hide, but could not quite manage. Night fell with a shocking speed that it does in the mountains, where the sun disappears behind the peaks and darkness rushes into the valleys like water filling a basin. Within 20 minutes, the forest around them had transformed from merely dim to utterly black, and their phone flashlights seemed pitifully inadequate against the weight of that darkness. They decided to head back, acknowledging that hiking out in the dark on an overgrown trail was going to be difficult, but agreeing that staying at the camp felt wrong in ways none of them wanted to articulate. They had walked perhaps a quarter-mile back along the logging road when Dylan stopped suddenly and held up his hand for silence. Jack listened and heard what had caught Dylan's attention. There were footsteps in the forest, moving parallel to their position, the sound of something large walking through the underbrush with the same rhythm and pace at which they were moving. Luke aimed his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam revealed nothing except trees as in shadow. The footsteps stopped when they stopped, resumed when they resumed, maintaining a precise distance from their position. Dylan suggested it might be a deer, But Jack knew the sound of deer moving through the forest, and this was not that. These footsteps had weight and deliberation, the sound of something walking on two legs, not four. They picked up their pace, and the footsteps matched them. They tried varying their rhythm, stopping and starting randomly, and the footsteps did the same, but with a delay of approximately 2 seconds, as if whatever was out there was mimicking them but could not quite keep perfect time. Then Jack heard his own voice calling out from the darkness ahead of them. It was his voice exactly, his inflection and tone calling out the same words he had spoken just moments before when he had suggested they move faster. The three of them froze, and in that moment of stillness, Jack saw something that made his blood turn cold. There was a figure standing at the tree line, perhaps 30 feet away, perfectly visible despite the darkness. It was him, not someone who looked like him, but him, wearing the same jacket, the same boots, the same backpack. The figure was making the same movements Jack was making, raising its hand when Jack raised his hand, turning its head when Jack turned his head, mirroring him with that same 2-second delay that the footsteps had maintained. Dylan and Luke saw it too, and the sound Dylan made was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. Luke's flashlight beam swung wildly as his hand shook, and in that moving light, Jack saw that there were more figures now. There was one that looked like Dylan, standing behind a tree and peering out with Dylan's face. There was one that looked like Luke, crouched low near a fallen log. And there were others, deeper in the forest. Duplicates of all three of them standing among the trees in poses and positions they had not made, watching them with expressions that were almost but not quite right. They ran. There was no discussion, no plan. Just three terrified teenagers running as fast as they could along a dark forest trail. Branches whipping their faces and roots threatening to trip them with every step. Behind them, Jack could hear the sound of pursuit. Multiple sets of footsteps crashing through the underbrush, and voices calling out in perfect imitations of their own voices, saying things they had said earlier. Fragments of their conversation played back to them by throats that should not have been capable of speech. Jack did not look back, but he could feel them back there, getting closer, and he knew with absolute certainty that if those things caught them, something unimaginable would happen. The three of them burst out onto the main trail that led back toward Jack's family property, and the moment they crossed that invisible boundary, the pursuit stopped. The footsteps ceased, the voices went silent, and the forest returned to its normal nocturnal sounds, crickets and the distant call of an owl. They did not stop running until they reached Jack's cabin, where they collapsed on the porch, gasping for breath and shaking with terror. Jack's grandmother opened the door, took one look at their faces, and knew immediately where they had been. She did not yell or lecture. She simply told them to come inside, made them hot coffee, and waited until they had calmed down enough to speak. When Jack finally told her what they had seen, his grandmother nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what she had expected to hear. She said the hollow had always been that way, that the forest in certain places did not just reflect light or sound, but reflected other things, deeper things, pulling out copies of people and turning them into something else, something hungry. She told Jack that his uncle had seen the same thing back in 1983, that he had encountered his own double out in those woods, and that the experience had changed him in ways that went beyond his appearance. She explained that whatever lived in that part of the forest did not just watch, it learned, studying people who ventured too close and creating imperfect duplicates that served some purpose no human could understand. Dylan never spoke about that night again. He avoided Jack for weeks afterward, and And when they finally did see each other at school, Dylan made it clear through his silence that the subject was permanently closed. Luke moved away the following summer, his family relocating to Ohio. And while he and Jack stayed in touch through social media for a while, Luke never once mentioned what had happened in the hollow. Jack himself tried to rationalize it, tried to convince himself that it had been shadows and fear and overactive imaginations. But he could not make himself believe that explanation. He had seen his own face staring back at him from the darkness, had heard his own voice speaking words what he had not said. And no amount of rationalization could erase the memory of that impossible encounter. Jack moved away from the hollow when he turned 25, taking a job in Lexington that gave him an excuse to leave the mountains behind. He told himself it was for career opportunities, for the chance to live somewhere with more options and better prospects. But he knew the real reason. He could not live in that hollow anymore, could not wake up every morning and look out at the forest, knowing what was out there in the deeper hollows, knowing that something wearing stolen faces walked among those ancient trees. His grandmother passed away 2 years after he left, and at her funeral, she was buried in the small family cemetery on the property. Before she died, she told Jack something that he has never forgotten. She said that his great-grandfather had seen the same thing back in 1940 during a hunting trip in that same part of the forest. She said it was not a new phenomenon, but something that had been happening for as long as people had lived in those mountains. Maybe longer. She said some places in Appalachia were different, that they had their own rules and their own hungers, and that the forest in certain hollows did not just grow and change with the seasons, but actively reached out, trying to pull in anything that came too close. Jack has not returned to the hollow in 15 years. The property still belongs to his family, and a distant cousin lives in the cabin now. But Jack has no intention of ever going back. Sometimes, late at night, he thinks about what his grandmother told him, about how the hollow has always reflected things back, but wrong, hungry, waiting. He thinks about his uncle, who aged years in 3 days, and never spoke about what happened to him out in those woods. He thinks about the figure he saw standing at the tree line, wearing his face and his clothes, and moving with his movements. And he wonders how many other people over the decades and centuries have walked into those deep hollows and encountered their own doubles, and how many of them never made it back out to tell anyone what they had seen. The mountains are old, his grandmother used to say, older than the trees, older than the memory of trees. And in the oldest places, where the forest has never been fully tamed and the hollows run so deep that the sun never quite reaches the bottom, something watches and waits and learns. Jack knows that now. He knows it in a way that cannot be unlearned or forgotten. Some places in Appalachia do not just have memories, they have appetites. And the hollow where Jack grew up is one of those places. Madison had been planning the Appalachian Trail hike for nearly 6 months, coordinating schedules with her boyfriend and researching every detail of the route they would take through the Nantahala Forest in western North Carolina. They were both experienced hikers who had completed sections of the trail in Vermont and Pennsylvania. And they approached this trip with the same careful preparation that had kept them safe on previous expeditions. Madison had printed detailed topographic maps, programmed waypoints into her GPS device, and packed enough supplies for 7 days, even though they only planned to be out for 5. Her boyfriend had triple-checked their emergency equipment, ensured their satellite communicator was fully charged, and reviewed the weather forecast until he was satisfied that the conditions would be optimal. They set out on a Thursday morning in mid-September of 2018, parking at the trailhead just after sunrise and beginning their hike with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from months of anticipation finally being realized. The first day was everything they had hoped it would be. The weather was perfect, with temperatures in the low 70s and a gentle breeze that kept them cool as they climbed elevation. The forest was in that transitional phase between summer and fall, with the first hints of color beginning to appear in the leaves and the air carrying that distinctive scent of approaching autumn. They made excellent time, covering 12 miles before stopping to set up camp near a designated shelter where several other hikers had already gathered for the evening. They shared a meal with a couple from Georgia who were attempting a through hike, exchanged trail information with a solo hiker who had been on the trail for 3 weeks, and fell asleep in their tent feeling satisfied and excited about the days ahead. The second day started just as well. They broke camp early, said goodbye to the other hikers who were heading in different directions, and set out along a section of trail that followed a ridgeline with spectacular views of the surrounding mountains. By mid-morning, they had covered 6 miles and were approaching a water source marked on their map, a creek that ran down from the higher elevations and crossed the trail at a rocky ford. Madison told her boyfriend she would refill their water bottles while he took a break and had a snack. She stepped off the trail, following the sound of running water down a gentle slope that was perhaps 50 yards from the main path. The creek was exactly where the map indicated it would be, cold and clear and running fast over smooth stones. Madison knelt at the edge, filled both bottles, added purification tablets, and secured them in her pack. The entire process took no more than 3 minutes, maybe 4 at the absolute most. She climbed back up the slope to the trail, ready to continue hiking, and her boyfriend was gone. At first, Madison assumed he had simply stepped into the woods to relieve himself, something hikers do dozens of times on a multi-day trip. She called his name, expecting an immediate response. There was none. She called again, louder this time, and listened carefully for any sound of movement in the underbrush. The forest was silent except for the distant rush of the creek and the occasional bird call. She walked up and down the trail in both directions, covering perhaps 100 yards each way, calling his name continuously. His backpack was still there, sitting exactly where he had been resting, with his trekking poles leaned against it and his water bottles in the side pockets. His boots were there too, sitting neatly beside the pack as if he had taken them off to air out his feet. But her boyfriend was nowhere to be seen. Madison felt the first flutter of real fear in her chest. She checked her watch and noted the exact time, then began a systematic search of the area, moving in expanding circles from where his pack sat on the trail. She called his name until her throat was raw, pausing frequently to listen for any response. Nothing. She searched for over an hour, moving further and further from the trail, looking for any sign of him, any indication of where he might have gone. The forest revealed nothing. There were no footprints in the soft soil, no broken branches that might indicate someone had pushed through the underbrush. No scraps of clothing caught on thorns, nothing at all to suggest that anyone had passed through that area recently, besides the hikers on the main trail. Madison made the decision to activate their emergency beacon at approximately 11:30 in the morning, 2 hours after her boyfriend had disappeared. The device sent a distress signal to search and rescue services, providing their exact GPS coordinates and indicating that they needed immediate assistance. She then used her phone, which still had a weak signal in that location, to call the local ranger station and report what had happened. The dispatcher took her information with professional calm, assured her that a team was being mobilized, and instructed her to remain at her current location. Madison spent the next 3 hours sitting beside her boyfriend's backpack, refusing to move in case he returned, calling his name every few minutes, and fighting against the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly. The search and rescue team arrived in the late afternoon. 6 rangers and volunteers who brought tracking dogs, specialized equipment, and the kind of calm efficiency that comes from experience with wilderness emergencies. They interviewed Madison extensively, asking her to recount every detail of the morning, to describe exactly what her boyfriend had been wearing, to estimate his physical condition and state of mind. They searched the immediate area with the dogs, who showed great interest in the spot where the boyfriend's pack sat, but then seemed confused, circling the area repeatedly without picking up a clear scent trail. One of the rangers told Madison that this sometimes happened when someone had been picked up by a helicopter or vehicle, their scent trail simply ending because they had left the area by air or road. But there was no helicopter access in this location and no roads within miles. The dog's behavior did not make sense, but neither did anything else about the situation. The search continued for 6 days. Rangers, volunteers, and law enforcement personnel combed through hundreds of acres of forest, using helicopters with thermal imaging cameras, drones with high-resolution video feeds, and teams of searchers moving in organized grid patterns across the terrain. They searched areas that had already been searched multiple times, checked caves and rock shelters, followed every creek and ravine within a 10-mile radius of the last known location. Madison remained in the area, staying at a hotel in the nearest town and spending every daylight hour at the search command post, desperate for any news. Other hikers who had been on the trail that day were located and interviewed. None of them had seen anything unusual. A couple who had passed through the area approximately an hour before Madison's boyfriend disappeared remembered seeing them hiking together and said they had seemed happy and relaxed. After that, nothing. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. On the 7th day, a pair of volunteer searchers found him. He was 10 miles from the location where he had disappeared, in an area that had already been searched thoroughly on 3 separate occasions. He was alive, but severely dehydrated, disoriented, and unable to communicate coherently. He was not wearing the clothes he'd been wearing when he disappeared. Instead, he was dressed in a shirt and pants that no one recognized, garments that appeared old and worn and did not fit him properly. His own clothes were never found. The volunteers called for immediate medical evacuation, and he was airlifted to a hospital in Asheville where doctors treated him for dehydration, exposure, and malnutrition. The medical examination revealed something else that disturbed both the doctors and the investigators who were trying to understand what had happened. His body was covered in bruises that formed distinct patterns, geometric shapes, and lines that appeared deliberate rather than random, as if someone or something had marked him with careful precision. Madison was at his bedside when he finally regained consciousness after 18 hours of medical treatment. He did not remember her at first, did not seem to know where he was or how he had gotten there. His memory returned gradually over the course of several hours, but there was a gap, an absolute blank space in his recollection that covered approximately 6 days. He remembered sitting on the trail eating a granola bar while Madison went to get water. He remembered feeling suddenly very tired, which was unusual given that they had only hiked 6 miles that morning. And then his next memory was waking up in the hospital with Madison holding his hand and doctors standing over him. Everything in between was simply gone, as if those 6 days had been surgically removed from his mind. Over the following weeks and months, fragments began to surface. They came in dreams at first, disjointed images and sensations that he would remember upon waking, but could not quite arrange into coherent narrative. He told Madison about hearing a woman's voice singing, a melody he did not recognize in a language he did not understand. He described being led through the forest by someone who looked exactly like Madison, who held his hand and guided him over rocks and through streams. But something was wrong with her face, something he could not quite articulate, but that filled him with a deep sense of wrongness whenever he tried to focus on the details. He remembered being in a cave, though he could not say how he had gotten there or how long he had been inside. and he remembered seeing symbols carved into the stone walls, intricate designs that seemed to move and shift when he looked at them directly. The doctors attributed these fragmented memories to trauma-induced dissociation, a psychological response to an extreme stressor that his mind was protecting him from fully remembering. They suggested that he had perhaps been abducted, that someone had taken him and held him for those 6 days before abandoning him in the forest, and that his mind was blocking the full memory because it was too traumatic to process. But that explanation did not account for the geographic impossibility of the situation. The fact that he had been found in an area that had been thoroughly searched multiple times, or the strange bruises that had already begun to fade by the time anyone thought to photograph them properly. Law enforcement investigated the possibility of foul play, but there were no suspects, no evidence of any other person being involved, and no way to construct a plausible scenario that fit the known facts. Madison became obsessed with finding answers. She began researching similar cases, spending hours online searching for any reported disappearances in that area of the Nantahala forest that matched what had happened to her boyfriend. What she found disturbed her more than she had expected. There were 8 documented cases over the previous 40 years of people disappearing from that section of the Appalachian Trail, and either never being found or being found days later in locations that made no geographic sense, with no memory of their missing time. In 1979, a woman had vanished while hiking alone and was found 11 days later 20 miles from her last known position, unable to explain where she had been. In 1992, 2 men disappeared from their campsite and were discovered a week later by a logging crew in an area that was not accessible from the trail they had been hiking. In 2003, a teenage boy went missing during a family camping trip and reappeared 3 days later walking along a highway, wearing different clothes and speaking about people who had taken care of him, though he could not describe who these people were or where he had been. Madison reached out to the Cherokee elders in the area, hoping they might have information about the forest that was not recorded in official reports or news articles. Most declined to speak with her, politely but firmly indicating that they had nothing to share. One elder, an elderly woman who ran a small shop selling traditional crafts, agreed to meet with Madison privately. She listened carefully as Madison described what had happened, and when the story was finished, the elder was silent for a long moment before speaking. She said there were places in the mountains that belonged to things older than the Cherokee, older than any human presence in the region. She said the forest sometimes borrowed people, taking them for reasons that were not meant to be understood by human minds, and that most of the time it gave them back, though they were always changed by the experience. She told Madison that asking too many questions about such things was unwise, that some knowledge carried its own dangers, and that the best thing Madison and her boyfriend could do was to leave those mountains and never return. When Madison pressed for more information, the elders simply repeated her advice and said she could offer nothing more. Madison and her boyfriend did leave the mountains. They moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where the land is flat and the ocean is visible, and the forests are young and do not carry the weight of ancient secrets. He still has dreams about the woman who looked like Madison but was not Madison, about the cave with the moving symbols, about voices singing in languages that should not exist. He sees a therapist twice a month, and the therapist helps him manage the anxiety and the nightmares. But there is no therapy that can restore missing memories or explain impossible experiences. Madison keeps a folder on her computer containing all her research, all the articles about disappearances and strange reappearances, all the maps showing the locations where people were lost and found. She has not added to it in over a year, but she has not deleted it either. Some part of her needs to know that she is not insane that what happened to them was real, even if it defies every rational explanation. The mountains took her boyfriend for 6 days, and when they gave him back, he was not quite the same person who had disappeared. And Madison knows, with a certainty that lives deep in her bones, that whatever happened to him in those missing days, whatever borrowed him and led him through the forest and marked him with careful bruises, it is still out there in the Appalachian woods, waiting for the next person who wanders too far from the trail. Luke had built a modest career as a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned places, documenting the slow decay of forgotten structures across the American landscape. His portfolio included shuttered factories in Detroit, decaying mansions in rural Louisiana, and ghost towns scattered throughout the western states. He approached each location with respect and careful research, understanding that these places represented real history and real lives that had been lived and lost. In the spring of 2020, Luke heard about a sealed coal mine outside the ghost town of Thurmond, West Virginia, a place that had been abandoned since a catastrophic collapse in 1962 that killed 11 miners and led to the permanent closure of the operation. The mine had been officially sealed by the state, but Luke's research suggested that the seal had deteriorated over the decades, and he believed he could gain access to photograph the tunnels before they were lost to time entirely. Luke arrived in Thurmond on a gray April morning when fog hung thick in the valleys and the abandoned buildings looked like something from another era, which in many ways they were. The town had once been a thriving railroad and coal hub, home to thousands of workers and their families. But the decline of the coal industry had transformed it into a hollow shell, where a handful of stubborn residents still maintained a presence among the ruins. Luke spent the first day photographing the town itself, capturing images of the old bank building, the abandoned hotel, and the railroad depot that now served as a museum. He spoke with one of the few remaining residents, an elderly man who had worked in the mines as a young man before the collapse, and asked about accessing the sealed mine. The old man's expression changed immediately, his friendly demeanor replaced by something guarded and uncomfortable. He told Luke that the mine was dangerous, that the tunnels were unstable and could collapse at any moment, and that local people avoided the area entirely. When Luke pressed for more specific information about the location, the old man gave vague directions, then excused himself, making it clear that the conversation was over. Luke found the mine entrance the following morning after hiking up a steep hillside covered in bare trees and old slag heaps from the mining operation. The seal was exactly as his research had suggested, a concrete barrier that had cracked and shifted over the years, leaving a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through if they were determined enough. Luke was determined enough. He had proper equipment, including a helmet with a powerful LED light, backup flashlights, a respirator in case of bad air, and a rope that he tied to a tree outside the entrance so he could follow it back if he became disoriented in the tunnels. He documented his entry point with photographs and GPS coordinates, then squeezed through the gap in the seal and entered the mine. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the smell of minerals and earth and something else that Luke could not quite identify. A faint sweetness that seemed out of place in the environment. The main tunnel was surprisingly well preserved, with wooden support beams still intact and old rail tracks running along the floor, disappearing into the darkness ahead. Luke moved slowly, stopping frequently to photograph the details that caught his eye. The rusted mining equipment abandoned where it had last been used, the lunch pails and thermoses that workers had left behind when they fled the collapse, and the faded safety posters still clinging to the tunnel walls. He ventured deeper into the mine, following the main tunnel as it branched into side passages and smaller exploratory shafts. The silence was absolute. broken only by the sound of his breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Luke had been in the mine for approximately 45 minutes when he saw the toy truck. It was sitting on the ground beside one of the old rail tracks, a small metal toy covered in rust and dirt, but still recognizable as a vintage Tonka truck from the 1950s or 60s. Luke found it strange that a child's toy would be in the mine, especially given that child labor in American coal mines had been illegal for decades before this particular mine had closed. He photographed the truck, zooming in on the details, and then continued deeper into the tunnel system. That was when he began to hear the singing. At first, Luke thought he was imagining it, that his mind was playing tricks on him in the oppressive silence of the underground space. But as he stopped moving and listened carefully, there was no mistaking what he heard. It was children's voices, multiple children singing in unison, the words of an old hymn that Luke recognized from his childhood church attendance. The singing seemed to come from deeper in the mine, echoing off the stone walls in ways that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact source. Luke's first thought was that there must be an entrance he did not know about, that perhaps local kids had found a way into the mine and were exploring it just as he was. But that thought evaporated as he listened more carefully to the singing. There was something wrong with it. Something off about the tone and rhythm that made it sound less like children at play and more like a recording that had been damaged or distorted. Luke followed the sound down a side passage he had not yet explored, his camera hanging forgotten around his neck as his full attention focused on the impossible singing echoing through the darkness. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and Luke's helmet light swept across the space, revealing something that made him stop walking immediately. The walls were covered in handprints, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pressed into the soft coal dust that coated the stone. They were small handprints, the size that would belong to children between perhaps 6 and 12 years old. They covered every surface, layered over each other in some places, creating a chaotic pattern that seemed to pulse and shift in the moving beam of Luke's light. The singing stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence, Luke heard something else. Footsteps. Not heavy boots like miners would wear, but light footsteps. The sound of small feet running through the tunnels. Multiple sets of feet, coming from different directions, converging on his position. Luke's camera began to malfunction, the LCD screen flickering with static and distortion, displaying images that he was not taking, images of children in old-fashioned clothing standing in the very chamber where he now stood. He heard voices then, not singing but speaking, young voices calling out to each other in the darkness, their words overlapping and echoing until they became an unintelligible chorus that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Luke called out, asking if anyone was there, his voice sounding small and frightened even to his own ears. The response came immediately, his own words repeated back to him in perfect synchronization, by what sounded like dozens of children's voices, all speaking at exactly the same time with exactly the same inflection. When he moved his light toward one of the tunnel openings, he saw them. Small shapes standing just beyond the reach of his beam. Child-sized figures that retreated when the light touched them, but advanced again when he moved the beam away. He could not see details, only silhouettes that were somehow darker than the surrounding darkness. But he could hear them clearly now, their footsteps getting closer, their breathing audible in the confined space. Luke ran. He abandoned all pretense of careful exploration and documentation, abandoning his professional composure in favor of raw survival instinct. He ran back through the passage toward the main tunnel, his helmet light bouncing wildly as he moved, creating dizzying shadows that seemed to reach for him from every direction. Behind him, he heard the pursuit. Small feet running fast, keeping pace with him. And he heard laughter, the high-pitched laughter of children who were playing a game that Luke desperately did not want to be part of. He reached the main tunnel and turned toward the entrance, following his rope guide with one hand, while his other hand held his flashlight in a death grip. The running footsteps were getting closer, and Luke could feel something behind him, close enough that he imagined he could feel breath on the back of his neck. He squeezed through the gap in the seal and emerged into daylight that seemed impossibly bright after the darkness of the mine. He kept running, not stopping until he reached his car parked at the base of the hillside. His hands shook so badly that it took him 3 attempts to get his keys into the ignition. As he sat there trying to catch his breath and calm his racing heart, his camera, which was still hanging around his neck, suddenly activated itself and began scrolling through the images he had taken in the mine. Luke watched as the display showed the photographs in sequence, and his blood turned cold. In the background of almost every image, visible only when he knew to look for them, were figures. Small figures in old-fashioned mining clothes, standing in tunnels and passages, watching him from the shadows. He had not seen them while he was taking the photographs, had not been aware of their presence, but the camera had captured them, dozens of them, child-sized shapes with faces that were just blurred enough that their features could not be clearly distinguished. Luke left Thurman that day and never returned. He spent the following weeks researching the history of the mine, digging through archives and historical records, looking for any explanation for what he had experienced. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The mine had used child laborers extensively before 1920, a practice that was common in the coal industry during that era. State records, when he finally obtained access to them, showed that 15 children had died in an unreported collapse in 1917. Their bodies never recovered because the company had simply sealed that section of the mine rather than attempt a dangerous and expensive recovery operation. The local historical society denied any knowledge of the incident when Luke contacted them, suggesting that he had misread the documents or misunderstood the records. But church burial records from 1917 told a different story, listing 15 children whose death dates were all identical and whose burial location was marked simply as unknown. Luke stopped documenting abandoned places after his experience in the Thurman mine. He sold his camera equipment, closed down his website, and took a job doing commercial photography for a real estate company, shooting bright, clean, empty houses, where the only history was whatever the staging company had invented to make the spaces more appealing to buyers. He kept the photographs from the mine on an external hard drive that he stored in a box in his closet, unable to delete them, but equally unable to look at them. Sometimes, late at night when he cannot sleep, he thinks about those small handprints covering the chamber walls, about the singing that echoed through tunnels where no living children should have been, about the shapes that his camera captured but his eyes could not see. He thinks about 15 children who died in darkness and were never given proper burial, never mourned publicly, never acknowledged by the company that worked them to death in tunnels deep beneath the West Virginia hills. And he wonders if they are still down there in the sealed mine, still singing their hymns and playing their games and waiting for someone to remember that they existed, that they mattered, that they deserved better than to be buried in unmarked graves beneath tons of rock and forgotten by the world above. Isaac inherited 60 acres of mountain property in the Smoky Mountains of eastern Tennessee from his grandfather, a tract of dense forest that had been in the family since the 1930s. His grandfather had used the land primarily for hunting, making the long drive from Knoxville several times each fall to spend weekends in the woods pursuing deer and wild turkey. Isaac had accompanied him on a few of those trips as a teenager, and he remembered the property as beautiful but isolated, the kind of place where you could spend days without seeing another human being. when his grandfather passed away and left the land to Isaac. It came with a warning that Isaac did not fully understand at the time. His grandfather had told him years earlier that there was an old lumber camp on the property, structures from when the land had been commercially logged, and that while he could use the land however he wanted, he should never stay overnight at those buildings. Isaac had asked why, but his grandfather had simply said that some places were not meant for sleeping and left it at that. Isaac decided to restore the main camp building as a hunting cabin. He was in his early 30s, working remotely as a software developer, and the idea of having a private retreat in the mountains appealed to him. He hired a contractor from the nearest town, a man who had experience with restoration projects, and together they began the work of clearing brush, repairing the roof, and making the structure habitable. The building was surprisingly solid despite decades of neglect, its thick timber frame still sound and its stone foundation intact. As they worked, Isaac found artifacts from the lumber camp's operational days scattered throughout the structure and the surrounding area. There were old newspapers from 1934 used as insulation in the walls. There were rusted tools, a bent saw blade, and personal items that the loggers had left behind, including a pocket watch that no longer worked and a pair of leather work gloves hardened with age and weather. The contractor and the workers he brought with him were efficient and professional, but Isaac noticed something odd about their behavior. They arrived early each morning and worked steadily throughout the day, but as 4 o'clock approached, they would begin packing up their tools with increasing urgency. By 4:30, they were always gone, regardless of whether they had reached a natural stopping point in their work. Isaac asked about this pattern, suggesting that working a few more hours each day would help them finish the project faster. But the contractor deflected the question, saying something vague about other commitments and scheduling conflicts. It was only when Isaac pressed the issue more firmly that one of the younger workers, loading equipment into a truck, said quietly that they did not stay up here past dark, and that if Isaac was smart, he would not either. The contractor shut down that conversation immediately, telling the young worker to mind his own business. But the comment stayed with Isaac. The renovation took 6 weeks, and throughout that time, Isaac spent his days at the property, but returned to his apartment in town each evening. Once the work was finished and the cabin was habitable, with electricity from a generator, a functioning wood stove, and basic furniture, Isaac decided it was time to spend his first night in the completed structure. He arrived in the late afternoon, built a fire in the wood stove, prepared a simple dinner, and settled in with a book as darkness fell over the mountains. The cabin was comfortable and quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional settling of the old timbers. Isaac felt pleased with how the restoration had turned out and looked forward to many future visits to his private mountain retreat. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning, Isaac woke to the sound of axes striking wood. It was not a single axe, but multiple tools working in rhythm, the distinctive sound of men chopping and splitting timber. The sounds came from outside the cabin, from multiple directions, creating the auditory landscape of an active logging operation. Isaac lay in his sleeping bag, initially disoriented and confused, trying to make sense of what he was hearing. His first thought was that there were trespassers on the property, that someone had decided to harvest firewood in the middle of the night, though that explanation made no sense. He got up, grabbed his flashlight, and went to the window. The beam of his light revealed nothing but trees and darkness. The sounds continued, the rhythmic striking of axes against wood. But there was no one visible, no source for the sounds that filled the night air. Isaac opened the cabin door and stepped outside, sweeping his flashlight across the clearing where the cabin stood. The sound stopped immediately, cut off so abruptly that the silence felt oppressive. He called out, asking if anyone was there, his voice sounding small in the vast darkness of the forest. There was no response. He stood there for several minutes, listening intently, but heard nothing except the normal sounds of the mountain night. He went back inside, convinced himself that he had experienced some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by being alone in an unfamiliar place, and tried to go back to sleep. The sounds returned at 2:30, and this time they were joined by voices. Isaac heard men speaking in the thick Appalachian dialect that had been common in the region during the early 20th century. Their words slightly archaic and difficult for him to fully understand. They were discussing the day's work, talking about which trees to cut next, complaining about equipment that needed repair, mentioning names of people who were presumably other workers at the camp. The voices were clear and distinct, close enough that they seemed to be just outside the cabin walls. But when Isaac looked out the windows, he saw nothing. He grabbed his phone to record the sounds, thinking that he needed evidence of what he was experiencing. But when he activated the recording app, his phone died instantly, despite having been fully charged. The voices continued for another 20 minutes, casual conversation between working men, and then faded away into silence. Isaac did not sleep for the rest of that night. He sat up in his sleeping bag, his flashlight in hand, listening to the darkness and trying to rationalize what he had experienced. As soon as dawn broke, he packed his gear and left the cabin, driving back to town with the intention of researching the history of the lumber camp more thoroughly than he had done before. What he discovered over the following days disturbed him greatly. The lumber operation on his property had shut down abruptly in 1934 after what the old newspaper accounts called an incident. The details were sparse, but Isaac found a brief article in the county archives that mentioned 12 workers dying when a landslide buried the lumber camp's bunkhouse while the men slept. The article said that recovery efforts were abandoned after several days due to the instability of the site and the danger of additional landslides. The lumber company had sealed the area and left, and the bodies of the 12 men were never recovered. Isaac returned to the property with new understanding and growing dread. He studied the terrain around the cabin, looking at the slope of the hillside above it, and realized with sickening certainty that his renovated cabin was built directly on top of where the bunkhouse had been buried. He was sleeping above the unmarked grave of 12 men who had died nearly a century earlier. Men whose bodies still lay beneath the earth, never given proper burial and never acknowledged with markers or memorial. The sounds he had heard were not hallucinations or imagination. They were echoes of the men who had died there, still going about their routines, still living the lives that had been cut short by falling earth and stone. Isaac made the decision to abandon the restoration project. He removed his personal belongings from the cabin, took photographs for documentation purposes, and put the property up for sale, pricing it low enough that he was certain to find a buyer quickly, even though he would take a significant financial loss. The real estate agent asked why he was selling so soon after completing the renovation work, and Isaac told her only that the property was not suitable for his needs. The property sold within 2 months to a couple from North Carolina who wanted mountain land for recreational use. Isaac felt guilty about not warning them about what they would experience at the cabin, but he told himself that perhaps they would not hear what he had heard, that perhaps the sounds only manifested for certain people under certain conditions. 6 months after the sale, Isaac received a phone call from the new owners. They asked if he had ever experienced anything unusual at the cabin, and the careful way they phrased the question told Isaac everything he needed to know. He told them the truth, explained what he had heard and what he had learned about the site's history. They thanked him for his honesty and said they had been hearing the same things, the axes and the voices, and that they had also done research into the lumber camp's past. They told Isaac they had contacted local historians who confirmed the story of the 12 buried workers, and that old county death records listed the men by name but marked their burial location as unknown. The couple said they were not going to use the cabin and were considering having it demolished, that they felt it was wrong to inhabit a space that was essentially a tomb. Isaac learned later that the cabin had burned down, supposedly from a lightning strike during a summer storm, though he spoke with a local resident who told him that the county had done it deliberately, that there had been too many reports of strange occurrences at that location, and that authorities had decided the structure needed to be removed. Whether that was true or simply local rumor, Isaac did not know and did not investigate further. He was simply relieved that the cabin was gone, that no one else would spend nights sleeping above the graves of men who had been forgotten by history and denied the dignity of proper burial. Sometimes Isaac thinks about those 12 men, imagines them going about their work in the moments before the landslide hit, unaware that they were about to die and that their bodies would never be recovered, never mourned, never marked with stones that bore their names. He thinks about how they continue to exist in some form at that site, their voices and their labor echoing through the decades, trapped in a loop of routine that death did not end. And he is grateful that he spent only one night in that cabin, grateful that he learned the truth quickly enough to escape, before whatever haunts that hillside decided that he should stay there permanently. Another voice added to the chorus of the forgotten dead. Dylan was making the long drive from Charlotte to his parents' home in the mountains of western North Carolina on a November night in 2020 when the fog rolled in without warning. He had made this drive dozens of times over the years, and he knew the route through the Blue Ridge Mountains well enough that he could navigate most of it from memory. The road wound through steep terrain, climbing elevation in tight switchbacks before descending into narrow valleys. A challenging drive, even in ideal conditions. But as Dylan climbed into the higher elevations that night, passing through the Pisgah National Forest, visibility dropped from clear to nearly zero in a matter of minutes. The fog was the thick, heavy kind that absorbs headlight beams rather than reflecting them, reducing his view of the road to perhaps 20 feet ahead of his truck. Dylan slowed to a crawl, his hands tight on the steering wheel, focusing all his attention on staying between the faint white lines that marked the edges of the pavement. He had been driving through the fog for approximately 15 minutes when he saw her. A woman was standing on the side of the road, waving her arms over her head in the universal gesture for help. Dylan's first instinct was to keep driving, to assume this was some kind of setup or scam. But as his headlights illuminated her more clearly, he saw that she was soaking wet, her clothing plastered to her body as if she had just emerged from water. She wore a long dress that seemed out of place for the weather and the location, and her hair hung in dark, wet strands around her face. Dylan's conscience would not allow him to simply drive past someone who appeared to be in genuine distress, so he slowed his truck to a stop and rolled down his window, keeping the vehicle in gear and his foot near the accelerator in case he needed to leave quickly. The woman rushed to his window, speaking rapidly about how she needed help, how her car had gone off the road down the embankment, how she thought there might be other people still trapped in the vehicle. She pointed into the fog in the direction she claimed the accident had occurred. Dylan asked if she was injured, and she said she was fine, but that she needed someone to help her look for the car because she could not find it in the fog and darkness. Her voice had a strange quality to it, distant and hollow despite her proximity to his window. And Dylan felt an instinctive unease that he could not quite explain. He told her to wait while he called 911, pulling his phone from his pocket and dialing emergency services. The dispatcher answered, and Dylan explained the situation, providing his location as accurately as he could, based on the last mile marker he had passed. The dispatcher said they would send emergency responders, but that it might take some time given the weather conditions and the remote location. Dylan assured the woman that help was on the way, but she insisted that they could not wait, that someone might be dying in the car and they needed to look for it immediately. Against his better judgment, Dylan agreed. He pulled his truck onto the shoulder as far as he safely could, grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from behind his seat, and followed the woman as she led him away from the road. They walked along the guardrail, the woman staying slightly ahead of him, barely visible in the fog. She turned down what appeared to be an old forest service road, little more than 2 dirt tracks leading into the woods, and Dylan followed, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog but revealing very little of their surroundings. Something felt increasingly wrong with the situation. The woman's clothing did not match the weather. Her behavior seemed off in ways he could not articulate, and her voice continued to have that distant quality even when she was speaking to him from just a few feet away. Dylan called out to her, asking her to slow down so he could keep up, and when she turned to look back at him, he made the mistake of shining his flashlight directly at her face. The beam passed through her slightly, as if she was not entirely solid, as if she was composed of fog and shadow rather than flesh and bone. Dylan stopped walking immediately, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. The woman continued to move ahead, beckoning for him to follow. But Dylan's survival instincts had finally overridden his desire to help. He turned and ran back toward the road, his boots pounding on the dirt track, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he moved. Behind him, he heard the woman following, but her footsteps were impossibly fast, covering ground at a speed that no human should be able to achieve. He did not look back, keeping his focus on reaching his truck, his heart hammering in his chest and his breath coming in ragged gasps. Dylan burst out onto the paved road and saw his truck sitting exactly where he had left it, its headlights still cutting through the fog. He sprinted to the driver's door, wrenched it open, and threw himself inside, slamming the door and hitting the lock button. Only then did he allow himself to look back toward the Forest Service road. The woman was standing at the edge of the pavement, perfectly motionless, her wet dress hanging around her and her hair obscuring most of her face. As Dylan watched, frozen in his seat and unable to look away, other figures began to emerge from the fog behind her. They were people, or shapes that resembled people, all wearing old-fashioned clothing from decades past, all soaking wet as if they had been submerged in water. They stood in a line at the tree line, perhaps 24 of them, perfectly still and perfectly silent, watching Dylan with an intensity that he could feel, even though he could not see their faces clearly. Dylan shifted his truck into drive and accelerated away from that location, his tires squealing slightly as he pushed the vehicle, faster than was safe given the fog and the winding road. He drove without stopping for 20 miles, not slowing down until he reached the outskirts of a small town where streetlights and buildings provided the comfort of civilization. He pulled into a gas station parking lot, his hands still shaking, and sat there trying to calm his racing thoughts and steady his breathing. His phone rang, startling him badly, and he saw it was the 911 dispatcher calling back. She asked if he was still on scene, and Dylan explained that he had left, that the situation had been dangerous and he had needed to get to safety. The dispatcher asked him to clarify what kind of danger he had been in, and Dylan found himself unable to adequately explain what he had experienced. He told her only that the woman who had flagged him down had not been what she appeared to be, and that he was no longer at the location. The following day, Dylan drove back to that section of road in daylight, compelled by a need to understand what had happened. He found the approximate location where he had pulled over based on landmarks he remembered, and he walked down the old Forest Service road where the woman had led him. In daylight, the road was clearly visible, overgrown but still passable, and it led to an overlook where a barrier had been installed to prevent vehicles from going over the edge. Dylan approached the barrier and looked down into the ravine below. There was no wrecked car visible, no signs of any recent accident, nothing that would explain why the woman had been standing on the road asking for help. Dylan reported his experience to the local sheriff's department, thinking that even if they did not believe the supernatural aspects of his story, they should at least know that someone had been standing on that dangerous stretch of road in the fog. The deputy who took his statement listened with an expression that suggested he had heard similar stories before. When Dylan finished, the deputy was quiet for a moment before asking Dylan if he knew the history of that particular section of highway. Dylan did not. The deputy explained that in 1967, a church bus carrying 23 people had gone off the road during a severe storm, crashing into a ravine and killing everyone on board. The accident had occurred almost exactly where Dylan had seen the woman standing. And since that time, there had been numerous reports of people seeing figures on the road in the fog, trying to flag down drivers, always soaking wet and always asking for help. The deputy told Dylan that 2 people in the 1980s had stopped to help these figures and had followed them into the woods, and neither of those people had ever been seen again. Their vehicles were found abandoned on the shoulder with the engines still running, but despite extensive searches, the people themselves were never located. The deputy said that local residents avoided that stretch of road entirely when fog came in, that they would take alternate routes, adding an hour to their drive, rather than risk encountering the people from the bus crash. He told Dylan that he was fortunate to have trusted his instincts and run when he did, that whatever those figures were, they did not mean well for the living who stopped to help them. Dylan asked why the state had not put up warning signs or taken action to prevent people from stopping in that area. And the deputy gave him a look that suggested Dylan did not fully understand how these things worked in small mountain communities. He said that acknowledging the haunting officially would be bad for tourism and property values, that it would open the county up to liability issues, and that, most importantly, putting up signs would require explaining to the outside world that something supernatural existed on that stretch of highway. People who grew up in the area knew the stories and knew to be careful. It was outsiders, people passing through who did not understand the mountains and their secrets, who were at risk. Dylan never drove that route at night again. He takes alternate roads now, even though they add significant time to his journey, because he cannot bring himself to pass through that section of highway after dark. He thinks often about the woman in the wet dress, about the dozens of figures standing at the tree line watching him, about the 2 people in the 80s who were never found. He wonders if they followed the figures too deep into the woods, if they became lost in some way that had nothing to do with geographic location and everything to do with being pulled into a space that existed between the world of the living and whatever realm the dead from the bus crash now inhabited. He wonders if the people on that bus are still trying to get home, still asking for help from passing drivers, unable to understand that they died decades ago and that the help they need is not something the living can provide. And he is grateful that he ran when he did, that some instinct deeper than conscious thought told him to flee before he became another disappearance statistic, another unsolved mystery whispered about in mountain towns where people know better than to stop for strangers standing in the fog on haunted stretches of highway, where the dead still walk and the boundary between worlds grows thin when darkness and weather obscure the rational daylight world. Ella had been working for the Forestry Service for 3 years when she received the assignment that would change everything. She was a forest ranger in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky, responsible for maintaining trails, educating hikers about wilderness safety, and monitoring the vast stretches of protected land that covered hundreds of square miles of rugged Appalachian terrain. The job suited her perfectly, combining her love of the outdoors with work that felt meaningful and important. In the fall of 2019, her supervisor asked if she would be willing to spend 2 weeks staffing an old fire lookout tower in a remote section of the forest, while the regular observer was on medical leave. The tower was located on a ridge approximately 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a hiking trail that climbed steeply through dense forest. Cell phone coverage was non-existent in that area, but the tower was equipped with a radio for emergency communications. Ella agreed to the assignment, seeing it as an adventure and an opportunity to experience a part of forest management history that was rapidly disappearing. Fire towers had once been essential infrastructure for detecting and responding to forest fires, but satellites and aircraft had largely made them obsolete. Only a handful were still actively staffed, maintained more for tradition and backup purposes than out of genuine operational necessity. Her supervisor provided her with detailed instructions about the tower's systems, the radio protocols she would need to follow, and the supplies that had already been delivered to the site. He told her the assignment would be quiet and uneventful, that she would spend her days watching for smoke and her evenings reading books by lantern light. He did not mention anything that should have served as a warning. And Ella later wondered if he simply did not know or if he had deliberately withheld information to ensure she would accept the assignment. The hike to the tower took Ella most of a day, her backpack heavy with 2 weeks' worth of food and personal supplies. The trail was well maintained at lower elevations, but became increasingly overgrown as she climbed higher, suggesting that very few people traveled this route regularly. She reached the tower in late afternoon, emerging from the forest onto a rocky ridge, where the structure stood like a skeletal sentinel against the sky. The tower was constructed of steel beams and wood, rising 60 feet above the ridgeline with a small enclosed cabin at the top that served as both observation post and living quarters. Ella climbed the switchback stairs to the cabin, unlocked the door with the key her supervisor had provided, and surveyed her home for the next 2 weeks. The cabin was approximately 10 feet square, with windows on all sides providing 360-degree views of the surrounding mountains. There was a desk with maps and observation equipment, a narrow cot, a small wood stove, shelves stocked with supplies, and the radio equipment mounted on one wall. The first 3 days passed exactly as her supervisor had predicted. Ella spent her time scanning the horizon for smoke, making notes in the observation log, checking in with headquarters via radio at scheduled times, and enjoying the solitude and spectacular views. The forest stretched in all directions, a sea of green broken only by rock outcroppings, the occasional distant ridge. At night, the darkness was absolute, and the stars were brighter than Ella had ever seen them. She fell asleep each night to the sound of wind moving through the trees far below, and woke each morning to sunrises that made her grateful she had accepted this assignment. On the 4th night, Ella woke to the sound of footsteps on the tower stairs. She sat up in her cot, instantly alert, listening to the distinctive sound of boots on metal treads. The footsteps were climbing the tower, moving slowly and deliberately, pausing occasionally as if the climber was stopping to rest. Ella's first thought was that another ranger had hiked up to check on her, though that seemed unlikely given the late hour and the fact that no one had radioed to announce their arrival. She called out, asking who was there, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the wind. Ella grabbed her flashlight and opened the cabin door, shining the beam down the stairs. There was no one there. She descended several flights, checking each landing, but the tower was empty except for herself. She climbed back up to the cabin, convinced herself that she had been hearing things or that an animal had somehow gotten onto the stairs, and tried to go back to sleep. The footsteps returned the following night at approximately the same time. And this time Ella was certain she was not imagining them. They climbed with the same slow, deliberate pace, the sound of boots on metal unmistakable. Ella opened the door immediately, flashlight in hand, and shouted down the stairs. The footsteps stopped, but when she descended to investigate, she found nothing. This pattern continued for the next 5 nights. The footsteps would begin around 2 in the morning, climb to approximately halfway up the tower, and then stop when Ella called out or tried to investigate. She reported the incidents to headquarters via radio, and her supervisor suggested it might be thermal expansion of the metal causing sounds that resembled footsteps. Ella knew this explanation was inadequate, but she had no better alternative to offer. On the 10th night of her assignment, something changed. The footsteps climbed all the way to the top of the tower and stopped directly outside the cabin door. Ella sat on her cot, flashlight in hand, staring at the door and listening to what sounded like someone standing just on the other side of the thin wooden barrier. She could hear breathing, slow and steady, and she could see the door handle moving slightly, as if someone was testing whether it was locked. Ella's rational mind told her to open the door and confront whoever was out there. But every instinct she possessed screamed at her to remain silent and still. She sat frozen while the handle continued to move, and the breathing continued just outside. This lasted for approximately 20 minutes, though it felt like hours. And then the presence outside the door was simply gone. The breathing stopped, and the oppressive feeling of being watched dissipated. Ella did not sleep for the rest of that night. She radioed headquarters at first light and requested immediate extraction, citing a personal emergency. Her supervisor was reluctant, reminding her that she had committed to 2 weeks and that finding a replacement on short notice would be difficult. But Ella made it clear that she was leaving regardless of whether anyone came to get her. A ranger arrived later that afternoon, hiking up the trail to relieve her and asking what had happened. Ella tried to explain about the footsteps and the presence outside the door, but she could hear how it sounded, how implausible and irrational her story appeared when spoken aloud. The ranger who was replacing her listened politely and then said he had staffed this tower before and had never experienced anything unusual. He suggested that isolation could play tricks on the mind, that the human brain was wired to interpret ambiguous sensory input as threats, and that what she had experienced was likely nothing more than ordinary sounds amplified by anxiety and solitude. Ella hiked back down the mountain, returned to her regular duties, and tried to convince herself that the ranger's explanation was correct. But 3 weeks later, she learned that the ranger who had replaced her at the tower had requested emergency extraction after only 5 days, refusing to provide specific details about why he needed to leave, but making it clear that he would not return to that location under any circumstances. Ella contacted him privately, and he eventually admitted that he had experienced the same thing, the footsteps that climbed the tower every night and the presence that stood outside the cabin door. He said there was something up on that ridge that did not want people staying in the tower, and he had no intention of finding out what happened if someone was foolish enough to open the door when that presence came calling. Ella researched the history of the fire tower and discovered that it had been built in 1935, part of a network of observation posts constructed during the Depression by the Civilian Conservation Corps. The tower had been staffed continuously until 1978, when the Forest Service had transitioned to newer detection methods and the position had been eliminated. The tower had sat abandoned for over 2 decades before being occasionally staffed again in the 2000s as a backup observation post. What Ella could not find in the official records, she learned from elderly residents of the communities surrounding the national forest. They remembered stories about a fire observer who had died at the tower in 1963, found dead in the cabin during a routine supply delivery. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but people who lived in the area at the time remembered different details, whispered stories about how the man's face had been frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and how his body had been found pressed against the cabin door as if he had been trying to keep something from coming inside. Ella left her position with the Forestry Service 6 months after her experience at the fire tower. She works now as a park ranger at a state park where the facilities are modern and the visitors are plentiful, where she never has to spend nights alone in remote locations, and where the only footsteps she hears are from people she can see and identify. Sometimes she thinks about what might have happened if she had opened that cabin door, if she had confronted whatever was standing outside in the darkness. She thinks about the observer who died in 1963, about what he might have seen in his final moments, about whether he opened the door or whether something found another way inside. And she is grateful that she trusted her instincts, that she remained behind that locked door and waited for morning. Because the mountains of Appalachia are full of things that walk at night. And some of them climb fire towers looking for company they should never be allowed to find. Anthony had moved to the mountains of Southwest Virginia for work, taking a position as a civil engineer with a firm that specialized in rural infrastructure projects. The job required him to spend weeks at a time in remote areas, surveying old roads and assessing bridges in communities so small they barely appeared on maps. He rented a cabin outside the town of Tazewell, a structure that sat at the end of a gravel road with forest on 3 sides and the nearest neighbor half a mile away. The isolation suited Anthony perfectly. He was recently divorced and welcomed the solitude, the opportunity to focus on work and clear his mind of the complications that had defined his life for the previous 2 years. The cabin was basic but comfortable, and Anthony quickly settled into a routine of long work days, followed by quiet evenings reading or listening to music. In his 3rd week at the cabin, Anthony decided to explore the surrounding area on foot, following an old trail that led deeper into the forest behind his rental property. The trail was overgrown but still visible, suggesting it had once been regularly used but had been abandoned for years or perhaps decades. Anthony followed it for approximately 2 miles, climbing steadily through dense hardwood forest until he emerged into a clearing where the ruins of a church stood among the trees. The structure was small, perhaps large enough to have accommodated 50 people at most, and it had clearly been abandoned for a very long time. The roof had collapsed, leaving only the walls standing, and the wooden door hung at an angle from a single remaining hinge. Wooden pews were still visible inside, rotting and covered in moss, and fragments of stained glass clung to the empty window frames. Anthony approached the ruin with the mixture of curiosity and respect that such places inspire. He walked through the doorless entrance and stood in what had been the nave, looking up at the open sky where the roof had once been. The floor was covered in fallen leaves and broken timber, and vines had grown up through the gaps in the foundation, reclaiming the structure for the forest. Anthony wondered about the congregation that had worshipped here, about why the church had been abandoned and left to decay. He took several photographs with his phone, thinking they might be of historical interest, and then continued exploring the clearing. Behind the church, he found a small cemetery, perhaps 20 gravestones arranged in rough rows. Most of the stones were so weathered that the inscriptions were no longer legible, but a few retained enough detail that Anthony could make out names and dates. The most recent burial appeared to be from 1947, and the oldest he could find was from 1892. Anthony returned to his cabin that evening and spent several hours researching the church and cemetery online. He found very little information. There were mentions in county historical records of several small churches that had served isolated mountain communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, most of which had been abandoned as populations declined and people moved to larger towns. The specific church Anthony had found was not mentioned by name in any of the sources he could locate, suggesting it had been forgotten even by local historians. Anthony found this both sad and fascinating. The idea that an entire community and their place of worship could simply disappear from collective memory. 3 nights after his initial visit to the church, Anthony woke to the sound of singing. It was faint at first, distant enough that he thought perhaps it was coming from a radio or television that a neighbor had left on, though that seemed unlikely given how far away the nearest occupied house was. As he became fully awake and listened more carefully, he realized the singing was coming from the direction of the abandoned church. It was a hymn, multiple voices singing in harmony, the kind of old gospel music that had been common in rural Appalachian churches a century ago. Anthony checked his phone and saw that it was 3:15 in the morning. He got out of bed, went to the window, and looked out into the darkness. He could see nothing unusual, but the singing continued, clear and distinct despite the distance. Anthony made the decision to investigate. He dressed quickly, grabbed a powerful flashlight, and left the cabin, following the trail toward the church. The singing grew louder as he approached, and Anthony could distinguish individual voices now, men and women and children, all singing together with the practiced harmony of a congregation that had performed these songs countless times. As he got closer to the clearing, he noticed something else. There was light coming from the direction of the church, a warm, flickering glow that looked like candlelight or lanterns. Anthony slowed his pace, suddenly uncertain whether he should continue forward. If there were actually people at the church, perhaps some kind of secret religious gathering or historical reenactment group, he did not want to intrude or startle them. He reached the edge of the clearing and stopped, using the trees for cover as he observed what was happening. The church was no longer a ruin. The roof was intact, the walls were sound, and warm light glowed from the windows. Anthony could see figures moving inside, silhouettes of people sitting in pews, standing to sing, and what appeared to be a preacher at the front of the church leading the service. The singing reached its conclusion, and Anthony heard the preacher's voice, though he could not make out the words, speaking in the rhythmic cadence of a sermon. The congregation responded at intervals, their voices raised in agreement or affirmation. Anthony stood at the edge of the clearing for perhaps 20 minutes, watching the service continue, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The church was a ruin. He had been inside it. He had photographed the collapsed roof and the rotting pews. What he was seeing now was impossible. He raised his phone to take a photograph, but when he looked at the screen, it showed only darkness and the faint outlines of trees. The camera was not capturing what his eyes were seeing. He tried taking a photograph anyway, pressing the button repeatedly, but each image showed nothing except the forest at night. The service inside the church concluded, and Anthony watched as the congregation began to file out through the front door. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, the men in dark suits and the women in long dresses, all of them moving with the unhurried manner of people completing a familiar routine. As they emerged into the clearing, they began to fade, their forms becoming translucent and then disappearing entirely, not walking away, but simply ceasing to exist. Within minutes, the clearing was empty. The light from inside the church had gone dark, and Anthony was standing alone in the forest, with his flashlight beam illuminating the ruins of a church that once again had no roof and no walls that could hold a congregation. Anthony returned to his cabin, his thoughts racing and his hands shaking from adrenaline and fear and the profound strangeness of what he had just witnessed. He did not sleep for the rest of that night. Instead, sitting at his kitchen table drinking coffee and trying to convince himself that he had experienced some kind of hallucination or waking dream. But he knew what he had seen, and he knew it had been real in some way that transcended normal definitions of reality. The following day, Anthony drove into Tazewell and went to the county library, where he asked to see any historical records related to churches in the area. The librarian, an elderly woman who had lived in the county her entire life, helped him search through archives and old newspaper collections. Anthony described the location of the church, and the librarian nodded slowly, as if she recognized what he was talking about but was reluctant to discuss it. She told him the church had been called Shiloh Chapel, and it had served a small community of families who lived in that part of the mountains. The church had been abandoned in the late 1940s when the last of those families moved away or died, and the cemetery behind it held the remains of several generations. Anthony asked why the church was not maintained or at least documented as a historical site, and the librarian became uncomfortable, suggesting that some places were better left forgotten. When Anthony pressed her for more information, she finally admitted that there had been stories about Shiloh Chapel for as long as she could remember. Stories about people hearing services being conducted at night, about seeing lights in the windows of a church that no longer had glass or roof or doors. She said local people avoided that area, that they considered it a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, and that the congregation of Shiloh Chapel had never truly left, even though their bodies had been buried in the ground decades ago. Anthony returned to the church one more time, in daylight, to confirm what he had seen. The structure was exactly as it had been during his first visit, a ruin slowly being consumed by the forest. He stood in the clearing and tried to reconcile the broken walls and collapsed roof with the intact building he had seen during the night service. He could not. The two realities did not align, and Anthony was forced to accept that he had witnessed something that existed outside normal time and space, an echo of the past that repeated itself for reasons he could not understand. Anthony completed his work contract in Virginia, but did not renew it when the firm offered him an extended assignment. He moved back to Tennessee, taking a position that kept him in urban areas where the past stayed buried, and churches were active places of worship rather than ruins haunted by congregations who refused to accept that their time had ended. He thinks often about Shiloh Chapel, about the people he saw filing out of that church and fading into nothing, about the hymns sung by voices that should have been silent for 70 years. He wonders if they know they are dead, if they are trapped in some kind of loop, repeating the same service for eternity, or if they gather willingly, finding comfort in the familiar rituals, even though their physical forms have long since turned to dust. And he wonders what would have happened if he had walked into that clearing while the service was happening, if he had tried to enter the church and join the congregation. Would they have seen him? Would they have welcomed him? Or would he have found himself trapped in that moment, unable to leave, condemned to attend services at a church that no longer exists in a clearing where the dead refuse to rest and the forest slowly reclaims what was once sacred ground?